Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Kareem and Over. Let's get straight into the next session here at Negotiating the New Normal, and it's going to be with Courtney, Savie, Laurence about the right to clean air. Now, this is all about a pioneering movement that is gathering pace in Thailand to develop the first citizen-driven Clean Air Act. It's through a unique policy process that allows legislation to be tabled at Parliament. And the 100% volunteer-run circular design lab in Thailand is stewarding the process, and they're in the middle of a digital roadshow that Courtney will tell us all about. As for Courtney, she describes herself as an explorer and connector by nature who thrives by working with others to bring system-changing and meaningful projects to life with a focus on innovation and sustainable development. So she currently works with the UNDP Asia Pacific Regional Innovation Center as head of exploration and volunteers as one of the founding project leads for the Circular Design Lab. So she'll now deliver her plenary talk. And if you have a moment or a comment or a question at any point, please do submit it in the box below the video, because it will be posing those questions to Courtney in the second half of this session. Welcome, Courtney. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And wonderful introduction, a lot of energy for so early in the morning, I think, where you're sitting in Mexico. So I just wanted to check, you can hear me okay? Is the tech working just fine?
I can hear you great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, wonderful. So yes, today I'll be telling you a story about a live case study that's literally happening on the ground, where everyday ordinary people have come together over evenings and weekends and look to think about how might we be able to impact and influence policy for climate change. But ultimately, there's much more to it. And in a way, it's quite ironic. I don't know if you've been catching the headlines. What's happening here in Thailand right now legally is quite complicated. There's protests all over the street, all over the country. And so this would have implications for the work that we're doing, but more about that, I think, a little bit later. And of course, that's on top of, I mean, we don't know where that's going to go. That's really an emergent situation. So calling for a change of the regime is literally happening just streets away. So here we are. So as I was mentioning, or thanks for the introduction, as mentioned in the introduction, Circular Design Lab is something that is a 100% volunteer collective. I'm one of the co-initiators, and I'll walk you through a little bit of the story of how we came to be, and then ultimately this connection to the legal process and the way in which we're looking at this interesting policy mechanism that's enabled here in the nation state of Thailand, that's been able to help us do this. But Circular Design Lab literally just started as an organic experiment. There were about 5 of us that were teaching at a local university here. This is prior to me joining UNDP, but I was teaching social innovation and design. And with 4 other faculty members, we just said, hey, what if we were to be able to use a process just on the weekends and evenings, like I already mentioned, for people to come together and tackle some of the more complex challenges. The first one we started with was specifically around waste management. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was, start with something that seemed that, should it be the private sector solving it? Should it be the government solving it? Should it be everyday folks doing it? So it was a big hypothesis and a big question that we asked ourselves, and we wanted to know if others were also curious about it. So some of the guiding questions that we had was literally around, how will we test what is possible? What kind of skills are required? What ideas are out there? And what was really interesting is that for our first event, we had over 100 people show up. And then for the 4 to 5 following workshops that were specifically around systemic design, which I'll share just a little bit around in case it might be a new phrase or term for you, we had about 30 to 40 different people coming on these Saturday workshops. So this is a little bit of the backstory, right? So not everybody has time to go to workshops all the time, but what we did find is that this social capital, this community capital or civic capital exists, and it's latent, and people want to do something. And so what we thought initially, okay, first and foremost, it's about creating space for community and the unusual suspects too, uniting across different lines of backgrounds and languages, etc. So we are in Thailand. I've been here for about 6 years at this point. And, it's a really rich city. If you've been here before, you'll see, automatically how robust and dynamic and frenetic and alive it really is, but it is a really an incredible hub for the region. But of course, Thailand carries its own challenges contextually speaking. It's got one of the highest inequality rates that exist for the region. There's a tremendous amount of environmental challenges happening, social justice challenges, you name it, it exists. But we also wanted to think, what does it look like to not necessarily solve a problem, because problems are always evolving, and an immediate static screenshot solution never really actually exists. So when we're looking at these complexities, it's really more in our perspective about influencing the direction of a system and the shape of a system. But first and foremost, you have to create the space to even imagine that. In dream and think, what are the future possibilities that exist? So that was another key element of what we wanted to build into the discussion and the discourse. And then of course, as I mentioned, I'd share a little bit around what do we even mean when we say systemic design. It's not as complicated as possibly as it sounds, but for those of you that are designers or working in systems change, which I think most probably on these sessions of this week certainly are, it's really about finding that overlay of looking at the complexity of a system and then identifying various leverage points and designing interventions specific to that, right? To mobilize a shift from a point where it is now to a point where an aspired future state, if you will. So some of this curricula we just lifted from different places. As practitioners, we love experimenting and playing with different perspectives, paradigms, lenses, and then certainly if you're facilitating, workshops and leading sessions, then there's a certain way you need to meet people where they are, right? And jargon certainly does not help in that journey. So a lot of what we were doing was kind of de-translating some of the jargon or the technical language around systems and design, and making it something extremely accessible for everyday people, but understanding that actually just creating a process is just simply a space to guide the conversation and create more space for listening, and create more space for co-creating an imagined direction. So the case study I wanted to share is the one that's actually, of course, anchored to the title of the talk, which is really around the right to clean air and the legal change process that we see as being a part of this and really important as a part of this. So it may not be a surprise to know that air pollution is one of the biggest risks to planetary health. It's the silent, literally a lot of the air pollution, if you're looking at PM 2.5 or 2.10, it's invisible killers. These are the things that are so not obvious all the time that you wouldn't even know that it's necessarily impacting you. So I'll start by sharing a little bit of the personal story for me, which is over the past several years of being in Asia, which I was in Japan before, and there was no shortage of poor air quality at different times. I noticed a significant increase of poor air quality. And actually, the majority of the most polluted cities in the world are actually based in the continent here. Now, if you really pull back the layers and you ask, okay, why is that the case? This is part of the big question mark, right? So no matter where on the planet you're sitting, I know, Adam, you're in Mexico City. Quite famously, Mexico City is one of the most polluted cities of the planet, right? And a combination of factors were able to move it into a different direction. So in many cases, it's also looked at somewhat as a success story of different mobilization of initiatives. But for me, it was quite simple. One is as someone that really enjoys being outdoors, I love to go to the park and go running, etc. I'm a little bit more attuned to noticing these daily changes when it gets worse. Here in Thailand, our winter time is actually still quite warm, but it does change and impact the way in which the air quality moves, right? It can get stuck and build up as well, but it's been getting worse, as I mentioned. And just a few years ago when I had my young son, I literally became so much more informed, because here I was with a young child, and I could not leave the house. I could not actually go outside without poisoning him to a degree. I mean, that sounds very harsh the way I'm phrasing it, but technically, if you're paying attention to the air quality monitors, which luckily there are quite a few in this country, not every country has a lot of monitoring stations or apps, etc. But you see the risk, you know that at a certain level, you are literally impacting your bodily health. And for young children, especially, are so vulnerable. And again, I just want to connect back to why we're looking at this from a human rights issue as well, not just only from an environmental and scientific lens. But as mentioned or shown on the screen, we see so many ramifications of this issue. So it really is a global threat. So back to what we were thinking, right? So as I mentioned last year, we started with waste management, and we had it's like a snowball effect, right? So we started with just a few different, snowflakes, if you will, and then started seeing where this would go organically. And over the summer, after our first 1.0 pop-up urban lab, we had about 20 people meeting every week saying, we want to do it again. Let's do a 2.0. And that led us to expand our themes. And so with that, we continued with waste management, but we also added air pollution and unsustainable fast fashion. So I became one of the co-leads for the air pollution track. And I'll walk you through a little bit of our process as well. But I did want to mention that what I also find fascinating is that we don't have a business model. We're not a registered entity. We don't really actually have a proper governance system, but we do have social capital and civic capital. And this in and of itself is quite fascinating. For myself, I'm an entrepreneur as well. I've started different social enterprises. And a lot of times the conventional thinking would say, if you don't have, no margin, no mission, if you don't have certain conventional structures in place, then you're not going to sustain. And funders might say, well, what's your sustainability model? Well, why would we invest in you if we don't even see where you're definitely going, right? Where's the logic model behind that? So I think to the point that the previous speaker was also just sharing, right? We're no longer in this linear system where, point A immediately goes to point B. So it's the Wild West of possibilities in many cases, and it needs to be that way in the sense that we have exponential challenges and we have to match them with exponential response. So lots of gatherings, lots of workshops, but to share a little bit about the approach overall, the framework that we're talking about here, and this may look familiar to you if you're studying systems, etc. But we are very ambitious. We do want to impact systems change, but to what effect, right? So a lot of times people talk about changing systems, but where, why, how, etc. For us, in the context of the themes that we've selected, which are really about climate justice and environmental change too, which of course impact social justice and other factors as well, political economy, etc. We started, the Circular Design Lab is primarily playing in this space of 1 to 4. And this frame to me is really helpful in terms of tempering patience, right? Sometimes we really want to, especially as an organic group, you want to move fast and understand exactly how you're making that impact. But to self-identify as where we are in the space has been a helpful frame. Two other frames I wanted to share with you, because this is part of the context of our thinking, this is part of our intent, is one way of looking at it is, and this is from the Verkana model, globally we can sense, and I think the Future Law Virtual Summit is an example. We can sense, we know we're in exponential transition. There's a dominant system that is under threat and actually is in its sunset years in many cases, if we talk about decarbonization or moving to renewables, for example. And there's an emergent system, and we are literally nodes of what that emergent system looked like. So as we transition from a dominant system to what eventually is the future state, we have to be able to navigate this transition and cultivate it and steward it. And so that's a lot of the work that we're invested in, is the stewarding of the decomposition of one and the construction of another. And of course, not everything will stick, and that's okay. It's all about how do you mobilize energy and how do you learn from the experimentation that's happening. So another frame that I think is helpful, I'm a very visual person, is where in these systems, these multi-layered, multi-noded systems, are we impacting and creating change? And that can happen at so many different levels, from the micro level of literally how are you, embodying the change that you want to see from your own personal power and standpoint, to how are you impacting, for us in this example with policy, or reframing, what do we even mean when we say air pollution? So more of the backstory is we've been documenting quite a lot. We write tons of posts. We try to capture videos, etc. as we go. So we try to work out loud and see where that might attract other interesting collaborators or networks. So just to kind of give this, the screenshot of how things went for our 2.0, we started with this kind of 1 to 4, you know, pop-up workshops, and it just continued to move forward. So with the air pollution case, I'm just showing you some pictures from our workshops themselves. You know, our group, we had to contextualize, of course. Thailand is huge. So even what's happening in Bangkok doesn't necessarily represent what's happening, you know, a few hundred kilometers north. In terms of the source points, if we're talking about what does that look like? How do we change it? And then I'm sure many of you are familiar with the iceberg model, right? So what we see manifest on the surface is often an expression of the symptoms, and the pain points are often embedded and deeply entrenched into mindsets, into culture, into ways of systems and structural ways of being for culture and society. So another piece to this is how do we move forward, right? So once we started the mapping, I'm kind of giving you an extremely abbreviated version. What we landed on for the context and the calibrating for the amount of resources that we knew we had, which are not that much, right? It's, as I mentioned, it's mostly volunteers. But we identified 2, and these red sticky dots identify what was the collective conversation around in our group. If there were a few things that we could do, what would create the most change? So you're looking at the Pareto rule, the 80-20, you know, if we did something here, it would have, you know, a greater impact over there. And so the 2 things that we landed on were, and this may seem very obvious, but education and awareness and policy change. Now, serendipitously enough, one of the women that came to our workshops was the co-founder of the Thailand Clean Air Network. And so this is where things get really juicy and completely related to the rest of the story that I will tell with you right now, which is that the Thailand Clean Air Network, another consortium of 100% volunteer driven as well, have been working on researching the issue. What is the science telling us for the case in Thailand? What are the laws, the policy, the regulations telling us for the case in Thailand? What are the implications of transboundary pollution? How does that all relate? And then what are some of the opportunities for legislation to actually make a safer container for what needs to happen to move forward? So the big point here I want to make is that the Thailand Clean Air Network, primarily environmental lawyers, doctors, educators, people that are very much 100% Thai, of course, as well, informed about the issue, have been creating and following a process that was similar to the EU's legislative process. So white paper, which is more of like a concept paper of what's happening, blue paper, an analysis of the issue, and green paper is the intent of having environmental regulation tabled at Parliament. So what's interesting here is that in the case of Thailand, there is a mechanism in the legal code in which if you have 10,000 citizen signatures for a policy process, you can have it tabled to Parliament for possible adoption. And so with that being the ability that's enabled here, the Thailand Clean Air Network, the whole goal for them was an environmental regulation. And for just to put it into simple words, to establish the first Clean Air Act ever. And so what we did is ultimately create a roadshow that was the idea, of course, is this education awareness nationally, and then signatures, because the faster we can move to getting the signatures and having it tabled, the faster we can move towards a very arduous process of trying to get legislation adopted. Of course, COVID hit, and so we had to pivot and move digital like pretty much most of the world in that sense. And therefore, what we created was, and this website is live now, but it's the Right to Clean Air Digital Roadshow. And we launched in August. And the idea is that for a 5-month campaign, we would have 2 tracks, inhale and exhale. Inhale is about understanding what is happening. And when we talk about what's happening, we mean through this documented process of what the Thailand Clean Air Network has been working on day in and day out for several years. And so what you'll see here on the screen is a blue paper, 200 pages, more or less. We were able to get it translated to English as well, which is really helpful. The website itself, I'm showing you screenshots of English, but we also have the exact same version in Thai language, of course, because we're in Thailand. The point was, how do we also make this accessible and digestible to everyday folks, not those that are necessarily working in environmental firms or NGOs that this is their job to know and learn and disseminate. It's actually, how do we make this something that is creative, interesting, and even fun for that matter? So the Inhale track was actually once a month from August to December. We have the authors of the blue paper literally in a live session just like this talk about the issues. So they tell us about what's already in the paper, but in a format that's very Q&A style as well. The Exhale track, so that's Inhale, educate yourself, get informed, and the Exhale is about taking action. And in this track, we've got a hybrid approach as well. So we have entrepreneurs talking about how they're creating printing ink out of air emissions, which is from Griviki Labs out of India, featured in Time as one of the most 100 innovative companies. We had high school students that were winning a competition around how to reduce the farmers burning crops in the north, which is part of the contributor factor here in the Thailand context, and repurpose the materials of the supply chain in a way that produces a higher value product that could be sold at market, for example. We have artists as well, and street artists to professors and beyond. Another key piece here is being on the ground. And so we also got a little bit of funding from MIT's Innovation Network. The Innovation IDEN Network. And we'll be next month meeting to do DIY air filters workshops. So we'll do train the trainer workshops with some of the more vulnerable communities here, make tutorials in Thai and English as well, because when the air gets bad, if you are not able to access an expensive indoor air filter, well, then you're just literally inhaling passively really polluted air. And that's completely detrimental, especially if you're in the more vulnerable populations of younger child or older citizen. So last month, we were able to launch another live in-person events. And this is when the Thailand Clean Air Network was able to first collect the signatures. So only in August, they were given the green light by the government to start collecting the citizen signatures. And the first 400 were collected here live in this event. We had at the top left of the screen, you can see a competition for young kids that were about expressing what it is that they see as the issue with air pollution. On the top right of the screen, you see one of the living performances of a student of one of the artists that's very connected to our network. You wouldn't see it from the photo itself, but he spent almost an hour sitting on the ground with a PM 2.5 mask with Thai baht, which is the local currency, crumpling it up and shoving it underneath the mask. So you see very different creative expressions of protest against the issue. At the bottom left, we had the clean air future. So it was a participatory design intent of this kind of mural where people that are stopping by, also in the background, you can see signing the petition, et cetera. If you're a Thai national, you're able to add your signature. But what is the clean air future that you want to see in 2030, for example? Usually we use 10 decades as proxies, but it's 2020 what we see now versus what we want to see. So we are literally just trying to continue the journey of building more momentum and awareness amongst everyday people. And just to contextualize it a little bit further, this is the Thailand Clean Air Network's information, but we're looking at a bottom-up design. And again, this wouldn't really be possible if it wasn't for the fact that Thailand has this mechanism for policy, which if every country in the world had a citizen-driven legislative process, can you imagine how much faster we could get towards responding to the climate issues that are happening versus having to lobby different folks or elect certain ones? And we all know right now, we can see many different experiments of democracy being completely, in a way, failing. So I would say that this to me is quite a highlight for a collective like this summit here, right? The Future Law virtual summits, to be thinking around how do we just literally have the infrastructure from a legal standpoint that enables a platform like this to come together. So this is just the image of the process of where we're going with this act, for example. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting is also about the reframe. So there's lots of literature and debate going on around how even climate issues, the climate crisis, climate justice, how all of that is framed is not necessarily polarizing in its own right, but it's not always reaching and connecting and touching everybody. And so it can be very divisive in certain spaces and places. So one of the things that we're also trying to do, maybe not overtly, but inadvertently, is actually reframe what we mean when we say air pollution. How do we reframe it into air asset? How do we create something of value out of something that's kind of conventionally looked at as extremely problematic? So there's a lot of creativity in terms of the intent behind how we want to frame even what the campaign is. So if you're keen to share or explore more, we're on multiple channels here. So the Right to Clean Air with #2. We were shocked when we found that this URL existed. You would think that maybe, wouldn't more people be thinking about it in these terms? But again, maybe it's the #2 also in there, because a lot of times don't put numbers in URLs. But righttocleanair.com is the one that we were able to secure. And on that site is all about the work that we're doing and trying to reframe the issue, counter the structural violence that's literally a part of the complexity, where you have industry polluting the commons and then everyday citizens taking the tax off of that. Another final note is that we partnered with the RSA, which is Royal Society of Arts based out of London, if you're not familiar with it, but they have the Student Design Awards that have been around for almost 100 years. And what was fascinating is typically they partner with corporate companies on design briefs to crowdsource possible solutions or interesting designs from students globally. And so Twitter has sponsored the one for misinformation. Philips has another one on healthcare. And when we spoke with them, we tried to find a corporate sponsor for air pollution and we couldn't. But to their credit, they actually unlocked legacy funds. So out of their endowment funding, they're sponsoring this brief around clean air futures. And therefore, we're really grateful for this, but Circular Design Lab is positioned as one of the knowledge partners. And we also were able to bring in the World Resources Institute, who one of the ladies that's who works full-time on the air quality issue, she's also on our advisory group. So we have, I think, a phenomenal, continually growing, emerging, evolving network. And just want to say thank you for being or listening to this, being here and listening to this, and happy to continue the conversations. And I think I put it in the description, but if anybody had feedback or ideas of what we could do to amplify the message, would be really happy to hear your thoughts around that. And also, one of the things that we're hoping to do is have this be a demonstration for the region as well. So if we're able to be a part of driving one of the first clean air acts of the region, I think that gives a lot of inspiration and hope for other parts of Asia, as you know, as I mentioned, as facing one of the worst air quality conundrums out of the planet if you're looking at it from a continental perspective. So Adam, over to you. That's all I have for the moment.
Wow, how exciting. Thank you so much for bringing that to us. It will be inspiring to a lot of people watching. Now it's your time at home or wherever you are watching this. If you have a question for Courtney or you have any kind of comments that you'd like to share, then do so, because we've got a few minutes now for that. We've already had a question come in, which is a great question. Unfortunately, we don't have a name associated with it. But Courtney, what do you think will be the tipping point for making the systemic change, both legislatively and consciously, to enable cleaner air?
The tipping point, okay. I would be curious to know who asked this question. So thank you for that interesting question. It's fascinating. I think tipping points are very top of mind right now. If you're looking at climate tipping points, literally, that's part of a mainstreaming discourse. There was a paper out just a few months ago around social tipping points, specifically in terms of responding to climate change. And I think this is where, I mean, I'm answering your question in multiple different ways, actually, but you know, there's a quote by Stacey Abrams, who's you know, in Congress in the United States, and she says, you know, I'm not optimistic, I'm not pessimistic, I'm determined. And I think that that quote resonates a lot with me when I think about tipping points also. What will be the thing that drives a tipping point? Well, it's certainly going to have to be a consciousness and an awakening, but an exponential effect of people being aware. And I have to tell you right now, as we're literally here in Thailand and protests are going on, just last night, it was high school students that were the ones being, well, in a way victimized, but they were the ones being shot with water cannons and tear gas. But it was mostly students. And I found that to be really, it gives me chills in a way, because sometimes, I also used to was teaching at the university here and in Japan. Sometimes I really wondered, like, are students onto what's really happening? Are they, and I think that it's when it becomes something that people just get and they cannot stand any further, that's when change will happen. And the air is getting so bad that this is also part of what's happening in the protests. It's not specifically only about regime change. That's the key overarching umbrella. But people are showing up at these protests demanding action for climate change. They're demanding action for other, social injustices and environmental injustice. So it's actually a protest of many things that are happening collectively. And you see this in the world all over as well. But we're here to fight the everyday fight, which is literally, you just can't stop and you won't stop until it changes. And so, like I said, part of our strategy was to make this as accessible and interesting in many different formats for many different audiences. And during our workshops last year, we did ethnographic research with some of the local communities. And here in Thailand, the majority of the citizens make less than $15 a day. And so if you are selling food on the street every day, your first worry is not going to be air, even though you may think it's affecting you, but you're just trying to live day to day. So we need to be thinking, I think, very multidimensionally about it. And it's so contextual and it's so related to culture. So there's never going to be a one size fits all solution, but there's spaces to be inspired by cases from different parts of the world.
Absolutely. We've got several people who are in this room with us as well. Ernestine, class, over. If you've got questions yourself or thoughts to share with Courtney, then please do contribute them. So many things to ask. I mean, the modus operandi of the Circular Design Lab appears to embrace uncertainty, which is great because we're living in a very uncertain world at the moment. But how challenging is that when you're dealing with people and organizations that you seek to engage with who want to know numbers and timeframes?
Yeah, actually, I guess we don't engage with those people so often. And I think that's part of what has to happen, right? Is when you're so limited with resources, what we have is a lot of passion and a lot of goodwill, and then very talented volunteers. I mean, we have professionals of all kinds of backgrounds, trained engineers, accountants, creatives, and everyone's just literally extremely on fire for the issue. So we go to where those others, where that energy is. And if someone wants to ask us numbers, I don't think it's really the most obvious. I mean, well, let me put it this way. We're not trying to be a conventional organization. We're not raising funds to like sustain our operations. And as a matter of fact, in 2 weeks, we're going to be running a Systemic Design 101 workshop in happy hour. And we're going to bring in, we're going to do it with air pollution theme, but we're actually going to bring in other folks from the Circular Design Lab Network working on food systems, working on waste, working on unsustainable fast fashion. And we're going to literally, a new experiment of how we're going to be running it is to see how we can get all of these different thematic challenge areas to see how we can interact and connect amongst each other, right? So food systems and air pollution, how do we build a connection point so we can work collaboratively together across all of these multidimensional challenges that are facing us all at one time? Because if we're thinking and working in silos, we'll just never get there. So it's also about mindset. So the more we practice that agility of thinking, the more people are able to like actually collaborate in different ways that hopefully have some kind of effect.
And like you said at the start, just dedicating some time to imagining different possibility for the future, that's a really important thing to do. Another comment that's come in no name again, incredible work in holistically approaching the problem on cleaner air. This work could be so powerful in other countries. I wonder if you've thought about that. You know, if this can be achieved in Thailand, what does it say about what could happen in the rest of the world?
I mean, for sure. I think, well, one of the things that we're trying to do is, I mean, and this would be really helpful if anyone has contacts in the media that want to cover and write a story. We're trying to idea network what we're doing as internationally as possible, because part of the challenge here, and I have to be careful with what I say, is it's easy to get shut down easily. So we just need to make sure that the more that we can have international coverage, for example, that adds credibility to the effort and it makes it harder for a case against the work that we're doing to be built up. As I think I touched on very briefly, but big issue, this is transboundary air quality issue. We have problems in Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. I mean, so we also would love to make this something of a demonstration initiative for at least our neighboring countries that might see some hope or inspiration in what we're doing, or even just lift and borrow. So we're one of the volunteers of our group, who is Thai, he just translated the legislation into English last week. So we're going to add that to our website as well. So everything is just fully transparent and out there for people to use or you know, take for their own good purposes as well.
Thanks so much, Courtney. I would love to talk to you for the rest of the day, but we've got to wrap up. So just really, really quickly before you go, do you just want to reiterate how people can get involved?
Sure, thanks. Well, I would love to, I have on the screen here the link to the URL. If you would like to offer your ideas or suggestions, that would be extremely welcomed. And you can message me on LinkedIn, or I have my Twitter here. Circular Design Lab is also there as well, but just please reach out and I'm happy to continue the conversation with whatever ideas that you might have too.
Okay, lovely. Thank you so much, Courtney. So that is the end of this Negotiating the New Normal session. Thank you so much for joining us.